to this next edition of the Value Exchange podcast. I'm Annabelle Lambert and I'm here with my regular co-host Rob Pye. Say hello, Rob Pye.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Annabelle.
And as Rob's just intimated, we are delighted today to be joined by Michael Haupt, who's based in the Valley of Grace, down in just outside Cape Town in South Africa. We met Michael towards the end of last year and sort of uncovered, very much a fellow traveller a thing going on. Michael finds himself amidst a global community called the Transition Collective, which is about 200 people, members, and growing probably, who are sort of in the face of societal and planetary decline that we all see everywhere all the time, understanding that we're in a period of transition and we need hope and confidence and ideas and innovation and let's do things differently. So looking to build sort of a better world by doing things a bit different. So that's what I understand Michael to be about, but I'm going to hand over to him to tell us more about who you are, where you are, what you're about, your journey, and tell us anything you want to tell us.
Well, great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, and let's see where it goes. So since you mentioned Transition Collective, what we call that particular initiative, it's a think, link, do tank. So we're going to talk mainly about what we do in the Valley of Grace as the do part of that. But what we wanted to do is specifically tap into the best available thinking and developments and initiatives and programs globally, and then bring it down and prototype some stuff in the Valley. So that's the connection. And how that came to be, a quick background. So I started off in technology. I helped launch mobile telephony in South Africa way back in 94. Was very fortunate for that project to go well. I was then headhunted, ended up in Sydney, Australia, and from there lived in 16 cities on 6 continents. So the best education I've had came at somebody else's expense by sending me working all over the world. But have always felt rather empty in the corporate world. Firstly, I was treated incredibly well. So I've lived the high life and, I've been to all kinds of places, which was incredible. And yet this deep sense of there's something more in life, something is calling and I can't quite figure out what it is. And then when the last assignment ended in Taipei, Taiwan, my then girlfriend and I decided we'd go backpacking through Asia. Let's get rid of the high flying corporate life and really go and experience life in Asia. And it was in that journey that unplanned and unbeknownst to me, the universe whacked me on the side of the head and gifted me with an out of body experience on a beach in Thailand. And to stress, there were no substances involved. I wasn't
no intervention, pharmacological intervention involved in that. No.
Right. And I wasn't going on any kind of spiritual quest. I wasn't searching for anything. It was literally just a break from the corporate world. And all sorts of things.
That's probably more common than you think, that out of body experience when you break from the corporate world. It's probably fairly common. It's Anyway, there's some research to be done there. As a left brain pragmatist,
I needed to find answers for what had just happened because it felt incredibly real to me. It wasn't just something I dreamed up. So that resulted in a 2-year sabbatical during which I dived deep into the world of consciousness research and discovered a whole world of stuff that I never knew existed. And then, of course, the challenge is after that you can't easily go back into the corporate world. I did try for some time. I got a managing director position in London, but this whole experience was on my mind constantly. And then eventually ended up in the systemic change space, doing consulting to various organizations, trying to answer the question, can we do something about the system that causes the individual challenges in society? So I met incredible people. I've seen just about all different angles of approaches globally. And now, being in the Valley of Grace, we're applying that and seeing if we can. Let me stop there first and check in with you.
Yeah, no, I'm going to stop because I've got to go back to the outer body a little bit, just a little bit. So it's interesting. We I think you know the chap that interviewed Ben Goldsmith on the program a while back, and he had this incredibly horrible experience of losing one of his children to an accident. And he then embarked on a 2-year exploration that kind of it did result in psychoactive substances, but he was exploring transcendence and the universe and the meaning of life, and because it was like this whole world was shattered, and it resulted in writing a book. I mean, it wasn't the end point, it was almost the beginning point. It was called God is an Octopus, to kind of sort of weave his sort of left brain into the situation. And again, it might seem uncommon, maybe, as everybody leaves a corporate, but it's just that consciousness of just stopping to reflect on things, perhaps a little bit more than we do in the hamster wheel, and maybe realizing that it's not so odd that if you have an opportunity, or you create an opportunity, or there is an opportunity, to just be a little bit more conscious, just to reflect a little bit more, which back to our own privilege of ethos, it feels like we're constantly in this out of body experience, really, because we're lucky to have some reflective headspace that we feel that, I don't know, I feel it's been gifted more than force. We didn't force ourselves to do it, it's just there. So I just wanted to sort of just put a highlighter on that point and go, well, it's a fantastic thing to spend some time reflecting.
And to echo or reinforce what you're saying, I've since subsequently met many people who've had similar experiences. And the sad bit about it is that not enough of us document or take seriously the messages that are sent to us. So, as a result of the experience, and as a result of talking to many people who've been through similar experiences, it seems to me as if there is a force, I call it the evolutionary impulse, that is trying to speak to us through the noise of our corporate lives and whatever else we busy ourselves in. And most of us just don't hear it. But when we do, the tendency is to be dragged back into the busyness of your life and then not take seriously what was communicated to you in the experience. And I can't help thinking, if we all took these experiences seriously, if we learned to expect them and cultivated the circumstances to enable them to happen more frequently, we'd be in a very, very different space now. We wouldn't even need to have conversations like this, is my belief.
But that's very powerful, very, very powerful. And we absolutely support it with value exchange. Cue Annabelle to promote value. It's like, because it's a monthly reflective conversation with yourself and others, because the others is quite important in our experience of that reflection. It's kind of like, okay, here's a 360, and it's a reflective conversation. It's not a balanced scorecard or anything like that.
So, because just talking about that moment for reflection and encouraging more people to do it, and there's a big movement about mindfulness and creating space to like clear your head and what that then does for organizing your brain and all this stuff. But I feel what you're describing is beyond that. Either that, or we continue to ignore the opportunities that we create sometimes to have that moment of like, Jesus, this is all wrong, is how I feel about it all. So yeah, interesting how we could do that.
In the experience itself, I can only describe it as a download. So you receive, in my case, it was a very specific vision of a very specific place operating under very different conditions and circumstances to the way we live life now, but in immense detail. And at the time, so this happened in 2004, which was a good few years before Bitcoin. I mentioned Bitcoin because there was quite a bit of notion around community issued currencies, phrasing that we can use now because technology has kind of caught up to it. But at the time, none of it made sense. So what I committed to do is, even though it didn't make sense, I wrote down, I spent 3 days without sleep. As memories of the vision came back to me, I would write and write and write and write, and carried that journal with me for 10 years, paging through it, just reminding myself of the vision. And to stress, there's nothing special about my experience. I've met many, many people who've had similar things happening with similar kinds of visions and ideas of the future, which implies to me that the future is already here. We may not be able to see and touch and feel it. There's the famous quote about the future is, well, now I've gone blank.
It's already here, but unevenly distributed.
That's the one, right? So our future is unevenly distributed. It may not be in the physical plane, but it's definitely there in the noosphere, in our consciousness, wherever it is. It's there already, and it's our role, for those who take this seriously, to tap into it and bring that future towards us. That's my view.
And completely relate to that. I mean, but it, I think people don't talk about it in the way that you've talked about it as explicitly. So it's kind of it's really good to surface it, because not only do people not document or act on it or listen, but often also don't acknowledge those experiences. And actually, Ethos started with a bit of an out of body with me in 99, 2000, when I had just finished this global bid for EY, which is 56 countries, and hadn't slept for a few days, and sort of started writing in New York airport. And I've still got the paper, because I still go, and it's called A Day in the Life of PyBiz, which is a vision of a human-centric world where organizational bureaucracy doesn't get in the way. And that was the start of a 20-year journey. And I had one actually early days of Ethos when we were incubating Team Army, which was some life coaching that an admiral I was working with at the time did almost for free for myself, my wife, and the pictures then were actually much more Buddhist. So I didn't have worldly possessions in that picture. So it's like, and I don't think I've ever shared that, certainly not publicly. So please forgive me for that moment.
Well, to pick up on this idea that we don't talk about these experiences, it's because people think you're a nutter. It's so different.
Well, they do in my case.
He is a nutter.
It's so different to what we've done,
In my case, it's true. It's like, yeah.
Well, it's not. I think it's everybody else who's a bit of a nutter, but obviously I would say that.
Okay, so let's move on now to the after that moment, and how you've arrived where you are now.
So the really profound thing that happened is 10 years, almost to the date, after that initial download and out-of-body experience, I happened to be driving into this valley for the first time. I'd never been here before. I'd heard about it, but through a series of coincidences, a friend from London was in the valley and said, come and visit. And as I rounded the final bend approaching the valley, that same vision from 2004 came flooding back in the same level of detail, with a very clear message saying, this is the valley where that vision will be manifest. Now, it's an incredibly emotionally and overwhelming experience. I could not continue driving. I had to pull over. I sobbed my eyes out for half an hour or more because of how compelling the message is. It's not just a random thought that flits in and out and the next thought comes in and out. So anyhow, since then, I've been on a bit of a journey as to what might it take, including dealing with the messiness of the incredibly complex human situation of the people that live in the valley, including bringing to bear some of these technologies where others have tested them before and have run into all kinds of teething challenges. So for 10 years, I've been on a journey of very cautiously saying, how do we bring this to bear? And in the meantime, the global geopolitical, economic, and ecological situation is placing more and more pressure on the system to bring to, because, we speak fairly easily and with a high level of acceptance around the concept of collapse across various domains. And so most of the people in the Transition Collective have, accepted that we are in collapse. There's nothing that can stop it. But the good news of that is that that's part of a cycle. There have been at least 26 civilizations that have been through that same cycle before. Based on those cycles, we can see where we are in the process. And the good news is that always after collapse, something emerges. If that didn't happen, then we as a species would already be extinct. So a collapse doesn't mean the end. It means the end of what we've known in the past, but it's the beginning of something new. And so that's what the journey has been, is to bring together all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And we're now sitting with a table with all the pieces on it. It hasn't quite been formed into a picture, but the picture is becoming more and more clear every day. And our dream is for the valley itself, one, to be a living laboratory where we test these concepts and make mistakes, but report and record those mistakes so that others can learn from us. And then, if we get this right, or when we get this right, for it to become a prototype, because there's other rural areas, there's river basins looking for something similar. There's lots of talk in the noosphere about what we're doing. The only thing we're doing slightly differently is taking some risks and getting the community involved, having the awkward conversations, addressing the past, acknowledging that there have been all kinds of colonial uh, uh, effects. And the fact that I have a white skin, unfortunately, makes it a little bit more challenging. But once you've earned that trust, the trust is real and tested, which is
And I think
the good news about
what is super positive about that last paragraph is that we're at the beginning of something, and it's just like, let's move on from collapse. You've kind of got that acceptance, and it's kind of like, okay,
Exactly.
all right, but we can talk about the past and we can talk about the present, but actually, let's look at the emergence of something incredibly exciting, which is not business as usual. It's not the same. This is not just a once in a century opportunity. It's like once in a civilization opportunity, and it's emerging. And actually, as you start looking for that, it's quite easy to see in the existing system and in new systems the sort of emergence of a lot of hope. Actually, I think the incredibly positive piece about your last statement was that we're beginning of something, so we don't need to talk about collapse. And I mean, almost that's yesterday's news. It's sort of like, okay, we accept that we're transitioning. But look at what's coming next in terms of excitement of something that's more humane, something human centric, something that is about well-being for people and planet and nature. And that's that. It's just all over the place in tiny pockets at the moment, and it's about joining the dots. So I think there's a really positive message buried in that sort of acceptance of transition and acceptance of our problems today.
Maybe if I may, to pick up on earlier, you said that this is a once in a civilization opportunity. It's actually more than that. So the cycle of civilization is roughly between 250 and 350 years. It's not exact. But a book, if I may recommend it, Emerging World by Roger Briggs, who has looked at the whole of 5,000 years of human history. And he's identified that in these various cycles of civilization, as they rise and fall, there is a bigger pattern unfolding. And he talks about 5 different phase shifts that have happened. I won't repeat them here because I can't remember them, and we may end up going down a rabbit hole that buries us. But it's profound, indicating that we're at a phase shift now. So it's not only the end of a civilization, but it's the end of a civilization and the potential of making a very significant phase shift. And so there's all kinds of talk about planetary consciousness from a governance perspective. How do we operate rather than top down, which is what many groups are trying to do now, coming up with ecological plans for the planet, rather to work in bioregions, and for those bioregions to roll up into a planetary plan. So there's a lot we could go into, but the phase shift is the bit that really interests me. So it's not as if we're just going to repeat the same forms of civilizations that we've had in the recent past, but that there's a potential now to leap into something that we can't even imagine. That's why another reason I'm cautious of people who can very clearly define what the transition path is. You can't define it yet because we're not sure what comes next. So we can tap into possibilities. Weak signals is a phrase we use a lot. What are the weak signals saying to us, and which weak signals deserve to be amplified? By amplifying them, you kind of lighting the next 6 feet of the path as you're walking down the path.
Okay, so let's get down to earth now and get down to the valley. And so there's this river basin near Cape Town. I think 20,000 indigenous people who um, live there. So what you can't tell us exactly what the how the project will unfold, of course,
Mm.
but just paint a picture that um, might give us some examples. I know you talked a lot about land trust and engagement with people and sort of different things to throw at the experimentation landscape to see what sticks and how that will evolve. Just to paint a picture of that for
Sure.
us.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. I'll certainly give a rundown as best I can at this stage. So, yes, the valley consists of 20,000 people in total. It's not all of them indigenous. We've got very different socioeconomic levels. There's 6 different human settlements. One is a white area, with fairly high valued properties, many of them even higher valued than in Cape Town. Um, and then going all the way down to the extreme poverty, mainly because there's very high level of unemployment. We're 35 kilometers away from the nearest freeway, so it's quite a distance to come into the village, and the only employment around here is from commercial agriculture. So there's only employment for 3 months of the year. 9 months of the year most people are unemployed, which leads to all kinds of social ills, teenage pregnancies, substance abuse. But the most concerning thing is a lack of purpose. There's literally no reason to get out of bed in the morning. And so that creates this whole sense of, why am I even alive? And that lessens the value of life. And anyhow, let's not get too deep into it. So things are not good. Um, and then over the years, the quality of the soil has been severely degraded because we're in a mountainous region. Fairly regular floods wash topsoil away and so on. So the opportunity is to restore the hydrological cycle, which is relatively easy to do. And there's plenty of research and pracademia that has shown how to do that. You basically slow down the runoff of water. Instead of it running into the 2 major rivers that surround the valley, you slow that down so that it sinks into the water level. Now, it's relatively easy to rectify the situation, but of course, it takes money, and these kind of exercises can't easily be funded. And so, how do we bring in external funding? This is where, as Rob touched on, we're experimenting with putting land into a land trust, which means that you remove that land from the ownership model. You may as well take the title deed and tear it up, because you're committing that land in perpetuity to various regenerative activities. And then we're tokenizing that land trust and making that available to, for example, family offices that want to leave a legacy associated with something meaningful. So there's a bit that we can go into there. But then bringing the community in to establish, we're inspired by a series of cooperatives called Sechem in Egypt. And this was a piece of desert land that an individual purchased many years ago. He's since passed on, but his son has taken over the banner. And they've attracted people to come and live in the area, completely regenerated the desert. You go there now and it looks like an oasis. And there are various cooperatives producing high quality, world class artisanal goods. And then there's a primary cooperative that does all of the marketing and distribution. So we're very inspired by that model. And there are already incredible products being made in the valley, but maybe not quite at the international standard yet. So with a little bit of training, a little bit of quality control, we can easily get to that position. But the focus is not so much on the products being sold, but on the restoration of the hydrological cycle as part of the producing of products here. So there's the kind of highest level that I can give. I hope that gives some
Yeah,
sense.
and again back to the futures already here, just unevenly distributed. We're seeing many more communities looking at trusts and commoning.
Yes.
And we have this wonderful ambassador on board, Guy Standing, who's written
Mhm.
many books on the commons, which is a
Yep.
sort of a depleting, an asset that's almost non existent in Western democracies now. And actually, one of our projects from Lebanon, water is a commons, and it's not owned by the state. It's a community resource that the government or private industry don't play in. So it's up to people and commoners to look after that resource, and that includes roads and water and other natural resources. And actually, if you look at trust base, so in the North Sea, the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet is a Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, that the proceeds from oil extraction or from the North Sea for their bit is all been put into a trust on behalf of the people of the nation. The people of the nation, this trust, actually invest that money for public good, but actually in old-fashioned capitalistic companies. It's not that the old and new cannot exist together,
Correct.
but it's like, where do the lines list? And I think that the knowledge that is out there that can look at experimenting, like, okay, well, how might we do something different? Is beautiful, and we've got many projects like that already that have found us, on the Commons Fund. So just to add a little slightly interrupted postscript to your piece there. So that's a great example.
Yeah, and it's not an interruption. I think this is an important piece of the puzzle that we all need to build on, this idea of the commons as the fourth sector. Now, your listeners have probably heard of the fourth sector mentioned before, and it usually refers to for benefit companies. But I think there's an opportunity to develop the fourth sector a little bit further than that. So bear me out if you don't mind. Hear me out if you don't mind. Right now, we've got the public, private, and NGO or civil sector. And each of those sectors have their own form of governance. In the private sector, the main thing that you're trying to accomplish is a return to your shareholders. In the public sector, you're trying to maintain social cohesion or ensure that your society doesn't collapse. And in the NGO sector, you're holding people accountable. So, for poverty issues, ecological issues, the NGO sector is holding the public and private sector accountable. But each of those forms of governance, we're kind of hitting a glass ceiling now. And the glass ceiling usually refers to salaries and so on. We're familiar with that use of the term. But in a governance sector, you're trying to now accomplish things where your governance is preventing you from doing so. So, for example, in the private sector, when your prerequisite is to make a return to your shareholders, when you now have to shift your focus and concern yourselves about the ecological damage that you're doing, you're often impacting the return that you're giving to shareholders. So this is why we could potentially create an entirely new form of governance around the commons, where we work in collaboration with the other three sectors. And is there anything wrong with saying to Mr. CEO, go off and make as much profit as you possibly can, reduce your harm where you can, and where you can't reduce harm, call on us. We'll come in and clean up the harm after you. It's just the way the system works currently. Rather than asking each sector to limit their mandate in some way. So ESG to me is a complete and utter farce. And I think we've had similar conversations before. Why not free up those requirements completely in the private sector and have a separate sector responsible for the equivalent of ESG with the support of the other three sectors?
Yeah, and really interesting. So Guy Standing, I've mentioned before, talked
Yes.
really forcefully, eloquently, writing and spoken about something called the Charter of the Forest. And the Charter of the Forest actually preceded the Magna Carta. And
Wow.
so this was a charter of the commons, and it gave common law rights to natural resources, land, etc. And typical, United Kingdom, we're great at inventing, but really we've forgotten all about it. We don't talk about this at all. But if allegedly, if you go back, people who were not landed gentry had rights to subsistence from the land. They could hunt, they could farm, they could gather, they could subsist, they could live on common land. And that proportion of our society in a sort of late stage capitalism seems to have shrunk to almost zero. There are no allotments. There are, well, there are, but it's a very underrepresented common land for the benefit of all people, because we've done the enclosure bit a bit too enthusiastically.
Well, there were a series of enclosure acts in the UK that essentially said the common land is lying fallow, or not. They didn't say lying fallow, not being put to use as well as it could be if it was in the private sector. And so a whole series of laws were passed, culminating, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1700s somewhere, that basically put an end to commonage, which is a shame. But it also creates an opportunity now for us to go back and taking the lessons that we've learned ever since we've gone the full-on ownership model. What can we apply into a stewardship model? And so that's really what we're testing in the Valley, is for the owners of the tokens that we issue. They don't own a portion of the land, they steward a portion of the land. And based on whether we do a good job or a bad job, the genuine progress indicators linked to the land also affect the value of the token associated with that. So it's similar to an ownership model, but focusing very much on how we steward the natural resources linked to the land.
And a shout out to our friend Vinay Gupta, who started a company called Materium. And we've known him for best part of 15 years, and he's making some really. We spoke to him recently, or are speaking to him, and developing. But he essentially runs a blockchain platform. It's still early days, which is about tokenization. So the technology is a tiny problem to be solved in terms of tokenization of trusts, etc. As you might imagine, the governance and legals of this, is probably that it's the behavioural bit, the will of, do we really want to allow assets, shares, land, property, valuables, or whatever to be able to be tokenized on distributed ledgers, etc. So fascinating, incredible innovation.
If I may pick up on Vinay and Materium, because his thinking has heavily influenced me over the years. I've listened to many of his talks. What Materium has done is brought a level of institutional recognition of these tokens that have been issued previously in the Wild West. Now, that is a development that has been missing out of this entire space. So basically, pension funds and insurance companies and the like will recognize the tokens issued by Materium. That's a very big deal. And it means that we can bring these big institutions into the conversation, which previously they wouldn't have done before. It's a very, very big
breakthrough. And that's the hard part of it all, is the how so most people would have heard of NFTs, this sort of random Wild West of producing a token of a headshot of Michael or something. But actually it's how could we trade shares rather than having exchanges and pieces of paper, and that actually have to be looked after by custodians, that actually you might have this on a public ledger where anybody can kind of come in, but it still has the same legal underpinnings of the mechanisms that we work within currently. So it's interesting, and who knows where it will go. Like so many of these innovations, but it's great example. So what next to talk about? Annabelle, do you have some questions? We need to bring you into this.
Well, I mean, I was quite interested, if you permit me, to go back to the fourth sector. I wasn't feeling I was quite understanding what you were suggesting when you said about freeing up organisations, the private sector, to just, not what, maybe I misheard you, but say not worry about all that stuff. And I feel that sort of unsettled me a little, because I'm like, then they can do anything and go and do anything, and we'll come in and we'll sort it all out for you. And I don't think that's what you were suggesting. I hope that wasn't what you were suggesting.
I was a little glib there, and you're right.
All right.
Now, if I can elaborate, so each of these sectors have their mandate, and the private sector's mandate is to go and make a profit, essentially.
Mhm.
And there are always unintended consequences. There are always costs to those activities. In the public sector, the cost to your activity is if you apply too much pressure to your population, then there's a degradation of institutional trust. People no longer trust their governments and so on. So the reason you have the fourth sector is not so much to allow them to go and do whatever the heck you want and we come in and clean up afterwards, but to have the checks and balances in place. And there's always a negotiation. So the private sector will say, we have to continue doing fossil fuels because our entire um, um, civilization requires that energy. There's nothing else that we can go to. Talk about renewables and all the rest. None of that is reliable. To which the fourth sector would say, we understand because we are also users of that energy. And this is what we can do to come and rectify the damage that has been done. There is a cost to rectifying that damage, and you need to contribute to that out of your profits. So it's this constant, and we can only get to that level of negotiation if we can be taken seriously as a sector, which we can't right now. We're completely dispersed. There's no common language. There's no even common thing that we're heading towards. But I can see a point in time where that level of negotiation can happen. It can't now, but hopefully that set your mind at rest a little bit.
Yeah, and it brings it very much aligns to Michel Bowen's thinking in terms of the peer-to-peer economy and the commoning of different types of assets. Where if you take, for example, a natural resource, and Guy again, sorry to reference him so many times, wrote a massive book on the blue commons, and so this is looking at the oceans as a commons and how we've depleted and pillaged and over farmed and resourced and polluted and destroyed. And it's a very large, depressing book in many ways because he's an academic and it's just utterly full of evidence and citations and that of what have we done with the commons, and actually looking at the mediation of that negotiation by governments is a nonsense. Because it's like, well, my bit of offshore, my near shore, what might I do with offshore fishing and trawling and that, and we're not looking at it as a natural resource that collectively has been plundered. How we might ever do that, because at the moment we look to a transnational organization like the UN, who I think have just ratified after 20 years a new version of their, the sort of fishing rights, or is a new thing that has come into force, but it's like a millionth of what we need to, there's no prevention of the pollution, prevention of overfishing, etc. And it's a sort of the fudge by the transnational negotiation. And you imagine it as a commons, it'd have a big bargaining power, wouldn't it, if you actually were stewarding that as a, you want to fish, you want to, do anything? Well, I am the Atlantic, or whatever. It's like it's a big big concept that I think was worth unpicking. I certainly think you did a really good job of that.
Well, the difficult question, if I may jump in, is how we fund this, or more specifically, how you create healthy value flow out of stored value. If you think we've used the planet to extract value, we converted it into financial capital. Much of that financial capital is now locked up, either in family offices or pension funds, or it's not flowing anymore. And we know what happens in nature when water doesn't flow, it becomes stagnant. And so we must create healthy value flows into things like what we're doing in the Valley and many others. Joe Brewer, you're familiar with him, he's doing incredible work, many others. But all of them struggle with funding, maybe because we haven't figured out our governance yet, whatever the reasons are. So if any of your listeners have some bright ideas around how we create that healthy value flow, that seems to me to be the next big human frontier for us to figure this out. Because once we unlock that value flow in a way that it's not felt as if this is charitable giving or a handout to somebody. It must feel as if we're all benefiting from this. And to the extent we can get that right, you won't be able to stop human creativity. You will see such immense progress, way more than what we've accomplished through as many COPs as we've had already.
Yeah, and I think this has got to be the ideal segue to talk about the Commons Fund. I just cannot resist a bit of
Yay.
an expose here. Not to preach, but again back to Vinay. I've just reread a paper that he wrote 12 years ago, which is exactly about
14.
that.
Yeah.
14 years, thank you. 14 years ago, because he's always been ahead of his own
Yeah,
Yes.
time
always
almost.
ahead of the curve.
Yes.
Um, and I read it 14 years ago, but then he's just pinged me and reminded me to reread it. But the paper, I think, um, fairly centrally, and a fairly central answer to your question about value flow, and then I'll get on to money in a second, is that actually if you think about all value that is in the world, really it's created by human ingenuity, collaboration, cooperation. In the history of time, it always starts with a few people kind of doing some things,
Yeah.
and what we're missing really, and this is the what you might call the theory of change of the Commons Fund. So it's a little bit geeky, but not really any more geeky than we've talked about already. Is that we miss the latent human potential of a vast swathe of society that actually has the answer at the moment. And
Absolutely.
that vast swathe of society that has is probably about 1.5 billion adults, people, young people in the
Mhm.
world who live outside of this traditional labour economics. We're three of them actually on the call at the moment. We're not being paid an hourly rate to deliver some goods or service, which economists call the means of production, because
Yeah.
that's the system. I give you money, you give me time, you give me the means to produce stuff,
Mhm.
whatever that stuff is. So by missing the 1.5 billion, we're kind of missing all of that think potential. We're missing all the free thinking that might say, well, how might we envisage a world that's different? And on the money flow side of it, why are we not doing that? Well, because people need to put food on the table. They're in chaos. They have no cognitive surplus, because actually, without money, you can't put food on the table or accommodation.
Yeah.
So we get back to looking at the money flow, and about $600 trillion is tied up in passive capital that is not helping people free from that rat race of um, uh, the politics of time, as Guy calls it.
Yep.
And the wealth is transferring to younger people. So about 100 trillion will go from boomers to Gen Z in the next decade. So
Mhm.
actually, project by project, person by person, if we used a tiny amount of that capital to free the cognitive surplus of some people, then those people would be able to then start thinking about what they'd like to do, what they'd like to invent, how they'd like to exchange value in the future. So rather than this coming as an innovation from the government sector, this is a fourth sector innovation in that way, because the stewards of everything that's not in the existing world of businesses and that, I very much agree with your hypothesis that we should almost free businesses of the responsibility. Go, can you just sort the world out for us? It's like, well, I'm afraid it's not gone very well so far, has it? It's so rather than just piling liabilities onto them, it's not, as Annabelle feared, let's just do what you want. But there's a hard negotiation. There's 1.5 billion people out there. There's
Yep.
land all over the world and natural resources that, on behalf, as stewards of the natural resources, it's a very big negotiating hand that
Mhm.
we're sitting on, and we just need a few more people to wake up. And there are. It's happening all over the place. We just need to speak to them.
Mhm.
So that's just like, wow, what a profound conversation.
Well, just to thank you, Rob and Annabelle, for the work that you're doing. If I can personally endorse what you're saying about freeing up human potential. So, if I use myself as an example, there's incredible work that needs to be done that we choose to do in the Valley, and it takes up a fair amount of time. But I'm distracted from doing that important work by having to put food on the table for my daughter and I. And so I've got to go off and do some commercial activity just so that I can pay the bills. And it's frustrating, and it's an incredible change of gears in your mind, in your body, in your psyche as you're doing these two different pieces of work. So just to second what you're saying, Rob, the amount of untapped potential that we could unlock by what you're doing with the Commons Fund, I think, is beyond our capability of perceiving.
Yeah, I think the energy, the positivity, the just the innovation is amazing. I think even in our, on our journey in ethos, just that starting point of like people, what are you about? What do you want to do? That's where it always starts.
Right.
It's a wonderful thing to just observe people when they go on their journey, and they'll have this
Exactly.
realization that they can do stuff that they never thought that they might be able to do, which gives them so much more than what they're doing. It sounds quite religious, but
A
it's not.
question
It's
to
human.
you. What do you say to the naysayers who I would imagine immediately ask, yeah, but if you give free money to people, they're going to go down to the pub and drink it all out?
I just don't think that is the nature of human beings. I think there's a lot of evidence that actually what we want to do. I don't think people can actually imagine what the world is going to be like, when we
Mhm.
reinvent it. And I feel, all the worry about technology is interesting, but we can't stop technology. But we have responsibility for it. What we do with it is a choice, that we have. I feel in some respects. So I think about what might be, because having children puts your mind in a totally different place. What are they going to do? Even 10 years ago, I was mindful that I didn't really know what jobs my children would be able to do. And now, I still don't know what jobs they might be able to do. Even in 5 years' time, you have to deal with, like you're saying, the 6 feet ahead. That's all you can deal with, is what you can see. But sometimes, I let my mind run a little bit, and I feel there's a space for a lot more human connection, a lot more creativity, a lot more arts. And it's interesting talking about artisan work, and just that those ways that we connect are really important to us, and we are so timed out of those things. I feel that's something we need to refine. And so, we've almost killed, the arts in the UK, because, it's the arts, why would we want that? But I feel part of that will be like an emergence of sort of people refinding those things, and actually what do we value as human beings? How do we value each other? Because I certainly don't value somebody making loads of money down the road doing something that I don't care about, that nobody cares about, that we don't really need, and that's my decision. But it's just so, I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I don't feel it's in the human nature to sit around doing nothing. We were just watching a video of somebody talking about basic income, and the first thing that somebody of a very set business mindset is, oh well, people are just lazy. And I despair of the benefit system as well, because it's set up for people like the 0.5% of people who might abuse it, rather than the loads of people who need it and use it well. It's just like, it's just my head in a lot, those
And
things. So
without being
I have more faith
to-
in human beings than the
Agreed.
naysayers.
without being totally contrarian, over the last couple of days, there's some interesting conversations and a video that Annabelle shared of a TV interview that was like, "Oh, how might you afford, basic income?" And and it reminded me of a story. My old boss in EY, who then was a mentor for years, and then became global managing partner for talent for EY. And when we were early days of Ethos, the conversation he would have had with you about the value of hope would have been: imagine that the value is like Disney, and what would be the experience of everybody that would go into the valley of this maybe some people have fast paths, and of course that mindset starts with the outcome in mind. And it strikes me that what we're doing is totally the opposite of that, in that we don't have one outcome that we're trying to build a civilization, a utopia that might have some people on the levers, or have some architecture that designs the valley to be something. Yes, we need natural resources, we need food, we need people, etc. But the traditional interventions, the first question is, what is the outcome? And what about if we don't know the outcome? What about if the outcome is Michael and these people in the villages locally exploring what's right for them? And actually, so somebody else, one of our young leader program, another story, that there was a venture that a few of them, with a steward, very experienced mentor lady. It was about social media, and called Sardines, and a group of a dozen local young people were working on this venture. And it was like, well, but was it successful? And it's like, successful? Well, did it form a company that made lots of profit and do VC, angel, IPO? No. Did every one of those people who participated on the project have a life-changing experience that they'll be forever in gratitude, and they will go on, but being really good human beings? Was it successful? Absolutely. Can you just talk about your definition of success? Is it human-centric? Is it, etc.? So I do think we need to be very careful when we bring these models, these mental models, that, or at least if we bring them, maybe we turn them upside down and go, what if it was the total opposite of that? Because that helps a bit of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're built for solving problems, aren't we? Humans want to solve problems. Exactly. We're just in this ridiculous context at the moment. But
I think just generally we've got to be very careful of this concept of human nature, because human nature is determined very much by the system into which you place them. The system determines behavior, which is what Danilo Meadows taught us. And so, yes, you may have certain behaviors, but look at the system into which those individuals are placed. And if you put them into a different system, for example, a basic income, then the human nature is very different to what you may expect of that. And that's confirmed by a very high number of evolution biologists who say the same thing. It's the system that determines behavior, which implies that there's no such thing as human nature, considering our current various systems and so on within which we operate.
So despite our various cuts and interruptions and internet blackouts, we've actually recorded over an hour for our half-an-hour podcast. So as usual, we've failed to stick within
overstayed our welcome.
But it's been the most amazing interview, Michael. I just want to give you a heartfelt thanks for that.
We haven't started, have we yet? I feel like we've still got loads to talk about.
The surface for next time.
Yeah.
Save it for next time. So until next time.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Cheers.